Good Friday morning. We've got another special guest today, Ted McKenna, author of The JOLT Effect. If you don't have this book, it is a must read. We're going to go through it today. It's really exciting to have Ted join us today. Before we jump into the content and to the meat as people are gathering here, a couple reminders. First, in the upper right-hand corner, if you have your mobile phone, you can like and subscribe. We've got over 150 best practice sales and marketing videos. If there's a particular topic that you're wrestling with, you can always DM either Meg or I, and we can point you in the right direction. But we would encourage you to like and subscribe in the upper right-hand corner. And of course, this is your episode as much as is Meg and mine. We've been doing this for over 3 years. If you have questions, drop them in the chat. We can promote those questions up and have Ted or Meg or I answer whatever questions you have. So grateful that you're spending your time with us today. Each week we start off with a poll. And this week's poll, we tried to relate it to the JOLT effect. And the question that I was asking was, what steps do you take in a net new sale if your revenue is stalling out? And I tried to isolate it more on the net new as opposed to cross-sell or upsell. I feel like cross-sell and upsell have been the theme for 2022 and maybe the back half of 2022 and all of 2023. I'm hoping that the pendulum is now shifted to 2024 in the acquisition. But my inclination on this was to the third bullet was build trust with guarantees. It was one of the lower selections. I don't know, Meg, what was your reaction to this poll?
Yeah, I like your options. I fear that there's another one that I wonder if it came up in your other votes that can be happening, which is, and there was an interesting post from our guest from a couple of weeks ago, Brandon Redlinger, on this one, talking about companies that basically abandon their ICP and start selling to anybody who wants to buy. And then down the road, they end up basically with a big churn rate from customers who weren't ever really appropriate for them. And I think that that's really interesting. I worry that people will either drop their pricing or make choices about selling to people who think they need the product, but probably don't or won't be successful with it, and shoring up a near-term problem only to create a bigger one down the road. In terms of reputation and retention and NRR and all that stuff. So that's, I would love to see the answer be build trust, but I fear it might be something a little more fear-driven. But Ted, you are the expert on this one. We are so lucky to have you speaking with us today. Thank you so much. Tell us a little bit about you and the JOLT effect, and then we'd love for you to weigh in on our poll.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do it. Thanks for having me. My name is Ted McKenna. I'm a co-founder of a company called DCM Insights, researcher by trade. So I've spent, longer than I should probably admit, researching sales, marketing, customer experience. And my days, I go back to a company called CEB, or Corporate Executive Board, which is now part of Gartner. Working a long time with Matt Dixon, I'm a co-author, I should say, of JOLT Effect. Matt Dixon would be the other co-author of the book, and excited to be with you here to share a little bit about the book, the study, and kind of what we're seeing out there in the market. And I'm happy to weigh in on the poll. I think for me, of all of these, I'll probably go with the unpopular, it looks like, choice, which is the narrowing buying options. I can get into why I might pick that, but one of the things we see happening when buyers get stuck in indecision, and I think there's a lot of us that have a big section of our pipeline that's stuck because buyers aren't making decisions. So if I can just unstick even a small percentage of those, it makes a very big difference. One of the big reasons they get stuck is because there are so many options. Their imagination kind of starts to run wild about all the ways that they can mess up. The simplest way to think about it is the more options there are, the more ways that I could mess up here. So better to constrain that choice set, be a little bit more prescriptive as to, I think you should do this rather than that. And it helps you on a whole bunch of different fronts.
Interesting. That's really interesting feedback. So you actually give them pointed feedback and tell them, hey, this is what you should do. Be very, very prescriptive. Am I hearing you right on that?
Yeah, one simple way to think about it is if let's say you're in a grocery store, you're going to take some things out of the shopping cart, and then in doing so, you're going to make them feel better about what is in the shopping cart at the same time.
Makes a ton of sense. I have read through the book, and I'll hold it up here again for those who are joining us late. Maybe you could share with us, what was the inspiration? I mean, you did a hell of a lot of work pre-AI, I might add. I would imagine it was pre-AI with the analyzing of all those sales conversations. Like, what inspired you to kind of go down this path? And then we can maybe get into the
Yeah.
discoveries of what you found in it.
Well, at the beginning of the study, Matt and I, by that point, we'd been working at a company called Tether for a couple of years at that point. So Tether is a conversation intelligence company, um, almost a data science and a software company at the same time. So they specialize in trying to understand at scale, all the things that are going right or wrong with buyers and customers, in the both pre and post sale setting. And by that point, I think we'd come to appreciate just how powerful unstructured data analysis can be. And that's different for us, coming in. Our history has been more studying structured, qualitative and quantitative type data. So, interviews and but also lots of surveys and structured fields. We'd started to appreciate just how much richness and how much direct application you get when you're observing conversation, at the point of the sale, quite literally. And also the analytical rigor you can get when you start to understand the relationship of both sides of the conversation, the seller and the buyer, and the interchange in between. And so because of that, we launched a big study of sales, ended up collecting about 2.5 million conversations. And part of the reason we were able to do that, I should mention, is because we also kicked it off right at the beginning of COVID, which I only laugh because for society it was terrible, but for us as researchers, it represented this pretty interesting moment because overnight, all these conversations that used to happen out of our purview, in coffee shops or customers' offices around the world, were happening, on Zoom or Teams, and we could record them and understand them at scale in ways we wouldn't have previously. And so that was kind of the inspiration for the study itself. And then as we got into it, we found some interesting things that caused us to kind of go in different directions.
Tell us, I'm always interested when someone goes into an intensive research process like this, there are always surprises. What were a few things that you found that you weren't expecting?
hmm Yeah, quite a few actually. So, I mean, I think the first thing we saw that we were a little bit surprised by was just the number of losses. The you could argue this is one of the biggest studies of losses ever done. So we're so used to as researchers looking at places where there's success, but here we were seeing way more losses. So the average win rate in our study was about 26%. But what we saw is, in particular, a lot of losses in places you would have expected wins. So 40 to 60% we found of deals ending up in no decision on its own was surprising. That's a lot of effort, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that go into then a buyer deciding to stop and do nothing at all. So I'm not losing to a competitor, but rather they're just deciding not to do anything at all. The size of that was actually quite surprising to us. But in particular, where they were losing in those situations, when felt like seller was doing all the things you would hope for, buyer seemed excited. They seemed like they had intent to purchase. They might have even selected the vendor and said, if I'm going to buy from anyone, I'll buy from you, and yet still was getting stuck. That for us was pretty interesting and a little surprising because, again, seller was creating that burning platform, doing all the things you'd hope to persuade and motivate, finding the need, selling the need, and it still wasn't enough to get them across the finish line. So that kind of, again, took us in a different direction with respect to the study. And then when you go to study what we've come to call cold feet moments, those places where it feels like, buyer seems really excited and then they start to go dark. They start to not respond to your emails, don't come to calls, they start to backtrack, a whole bunch of different ways in which you could categorize cold feet moments. We saw high performers acting quite differently than their peers. um, and that was another thing that was kind of surprising to us because what we found is most sellers in those situations, in those cold feet moments, they make things worse, not better. So they're actually their own worst enemy in those situations. To oversimplify kind of what's happening here, so if you think about a typical decision process, and after I've got the buyer to agree that change is necessary, there's a whole bunch of things that have to happen to get through to that decision. Terms have to be considered, conditions have to be weighed, legal might get involved. Lots of things can go wrong there. What we found is in those situations, when it feels like buyer was excited, they seemed like they were inclined to purchase, and then they start to go dark and they start to backtrack, which happens a lot, right? In those situations, we've found is that most sellers interpret that as a problem of persuasion and motivation. Like they must not want it enough. Like they saying they do, but they must not, because if they did, if they really wanted it enough, that ought to be enough to push past these concerns, and that ought to be enough to really get them to show up for these calls. They're not motivated enough, and so I double down on that case for change, right? Like you really need this, and then if that doesn't work, I kind of run to the pain and I try to show all the bad things that will happen if they don't make this change. I throw fear on top of that situation, and what we saw in our model that we built, this predictive model we built, was in those situations when they do that, it backfires 84% of the time. It makes things worse, not better. That was pretty surprising to us because that was the conventional wisdom at the time is look, if the buyer gets stuck, it's probably because they just don't want it enough. Throw more pain on it. In our challenger sale days, we would have said the pain of same has to feel greater than the pain of change. You just haven't done your job to draw up the pain of same. So go back and do that. And we were seeing very clearly in the data that was backfiring. It was making things worse, not better. You're taking already what we then learned later was a really terrified customer. They actually were very terrified for different reasons, though. And then we were throwing more fear on top of it, and it was backfiring.
It's almost counterintuitive in a way, in how you're describing it. You'd think that the adding the fear would be helpful, and maybe it's just the conditioning of sales. Maybe just kind of extending that and thinking about the model and turning it on its ear a bit and thinking about marketers. In this environment, we've seen a lot of sales slowdowns
Hmm.
just because of the economy or more buyers or the buying committee has expanded. In your experience, what do you feel like marketers could be doing to help the sales in a slowing, economy or a slowing
Yeah,
of the pipeline? What are a couple things that you think would be helpful, and maybe not so helpful if
yeah.
you've seen that?
Well, I think it's first important to just understand what is indecision and what's driving that. When a buyer, it's not so much that they don't believe that your thing is beneficial, or that they don't believe your business case, or that they don't believe that your ROI calculator works, right? Or that the customer's not happy, but there's a whole other series of reasons why that they're getting stuck. Indecision is really rooted in their fear that they'll make this decision, it will go wrong, and they're going to get blamed. So this is really about a fear of messing up. It's not about their fear that they're going to miss out on all these potential returns. That's an important component. You've got to overcome that as part of any decision. But very often in these situations, you actually have overcome that. They've overcome indifference. They aren't indifferent to your problem. They aren't indifferent to you as the provider. They are fearful though that they're going to make a mistake. And when that happens, they're going to get blamed. And so if I'm a marketer, I look to address indecision as best as I can. Um, by the way, I should mention that tight budgetary environments can actually heighten indecision. Less dollars to go around, more scrutiny on those dollars that I have available to me, more eyeballs against those, the stakes rise, consequences rise. So lots of reasons why that could heighten indecision. And so, whether I'm in marketing or in sales, I would look to try to reduce that fear of messing up. How can I make it such that it feels like for the buyer, the likelihood of that mess up is lower, or the consequence of it is lower?
And I think that's a really, really great thing to understand. I would love to know about the, what was it, 16%, the other side of the 84, who were successful in those cold feet moments. What were some of the things they do differently, and what can we learn from them?
Yeah, so that's really the Jolt playbook, right? Is the ability for us to not just draw up the fear that we use as a way to help people understand the cost of inaction, but also reduce the fear of messing up, to help them understand why that action shouldn't be something they should be fearful about. So Jolt is an acronym. Stands for the four key behaviors we found in a study that high performers do differently than their peers. It also is meant to have double meaning. So we're jolting customers into action past their indecision. So the four key behaviors that I think help you to succeed in those moments. First one is the J, is the judging level of indecision. So this is just trying to help understand the nature and the size and the depth and the breadth of indecision. Now, as a seller, that helps me to better forecast against it, to qualify that opportunity. Can they even come to a decision at all? And if not, maybe I ought to put this on the back burner. But in doing so, I also learned a little bit about the type of indecision they have. Some buyers are really stuck for different reasons. In the context of a purchase, we find three big fears that hang these buyers up. The first one being, I mentioned this earlier, about the number of options available to them. So even after they believe that they should purchase, they still have to make all these decisions about how to go forward. What do I go and buy? Contract length, configuration, implementation, onboarding, all integrations, data migration, all sorts of decisions they have to make, and they all look right. Buyers aren't very good at trade-offs, and so they struggle with which path to go down. They feel like it's going to be an irreversible decision that they'll regret. So the seller in that moment, the skill that's aligned to that is offering a very firm and personal recommendation. And in doing so, in many ways, I'm trying to signal to the buyer that I'm sharing in that choice with them. I'm shifting a little bit of that blame from the buyer to me as the seller. And recommendations, that sounds like an obvious thing. I can tell you from the data, it's not something that's very common that seller will do. We tend to go more ask. We try to go back to our diagnosis roots to make sure that we're deferential to the buyer, and that we're grounding it in what's most important to them. And it doesn't work. It doesn't shift any of that blame for them. The L is about limiting the exploration, and that's particularly useful for places where the buyer is stuck because they are into analysis paralysis. They feel like there's so much information out there that they have to become the expert, and until they are the expert, they aren't really a fully informed purchaser for their organization. So they have to keep pushing and keep learning, and keep turning over every hood to make sure they understand all the implications of this purchase before they're ready to move forward. Now, you can't just ask the buyer to stop asking questions. So you've got to find ways to limit that exploration to healthy rather than excessive levels. Some of that's about earning back a little trust so that they believe that, in fact, you have their best interest in mind and that you've done some of this homework for them. And then other times there's some technique involved in making sure that you're helping the buyer understand that you've been down this road before, you know where this path goes, and more information, more demos, more exploration at that point isn't really going to change their decision calculus. So let's move forward. And then the T is really helpful. That taking risk off the table is really helpful in situations where the buyer feels like no matter how many assurances you've given them, they're going to be the one. You know, yes, you've got case studies. Yes, I've done this reference call, but we're different. We're unique, and we screw things up all the time. We're going to mess this up. So I need more assurance from you. So the skill there is really around setting clear expectations with their buyer about what's believable, what's practical, what's achievable for those buyers, and then when necessary, I use some safety nets as a way to de-risk that purchase, give them some downside protection against that decision.
In
What's an
today's,
example? Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
go
John.
ahead, go ahead.
I'm just curious. What are some examples of safety nets that you think companies can offer?
Yeah. Um, so we certainly don't have an exhaustive list of them. And I think the most important lesson for people in B2B sales is to have a plan and try something. Because what often happens in B2B sales is that we don't actually offer any safety net at all. We assume we're not authorized or permissioned to do this. We're not a retail store. We don't have receipts. You can't walk into the store and just exchange our thing. I as a seller can't offer a cancellation clause, so therefore I just don't do anything at all. And then we're surprised when it gets stuck late stage. So at least have some plan in place. I think the second lesson is try to have a sense for whether the perception whether it's more perception or reality. There are times when the buyer, their imagination has run so wild that they perceive the mess up to be more likely than it actually is. That they start to worry all about all these things that in your heart of hearts is going to be perfectly fine. You do this all the time. This is something that you just kind of run off, tackle left, and you're perfectly capable of helping them to enact this change. And so in those cases, there are some less formal and even sort of cheaper things that you can do as a way to signal to them that you're going to be there for them. You're going to walk the walk. I don't love the term mutual value plan, even though I think that's a typical thing that organizations do as a way to signal to how are you going to as the ROI. A mutual action plan perhaps is a better way to think about this because in this vein, the mutual action plan is helping to signal to the buyer, look, we've got this plan in place. We know what's going to happen on day 1, day 30, day 60, day 90. We've got a team in place. It's on paper. There's a process. Executive sponsorship is another one. It's kind of like a bat phone to the senior leader. Like if something were to go wrong, you've got recourse, in these situations. But those are probably most useful in situations when it is more perception than reality. If they've got some division that's the cash cow that has all sorts of um, variance in the potential outcome, and they're quite accurate in that if this thing could actually really go wrong. That there's lots of dependencies, there's lots of unknowns, and once you get in there, you can't guarantee me that something won't go wrong. Yeah, in that case, you might have to take some risk off the table. Maybe start smaller, maybe some contractual terms. Those are things you might need to seek permission for, and so you'd rather those out. But sometimes, something is better than nothing for that buyer who's really stuck and just not going to make a decision.
Since you did the initial analysis and it looked like it was copywritten in 2022, and this has been kind of a wonky period, the last 6 to 9 months, what have
Yeah,
you seen like accelerate or decelerate from your initial findings here in this kind of really wonky time?
yeah. Well, in SaaS and tech circles, I think in particular, almost from the point that I think the book came out in September of 2022, which was like right at the point when SaaS kind of hit that point. And so, budget reason for economy reasons, but mostly for budget reasons, concerns about where things are going. So buyers just sort of tightening things up and just not willing to entertain the notion. Interestingly enough, for different reasons, I think the advent of AI and other things have made buyers so they're actually at the same time more willing to take a visit, more willing to have conversations. So we're at least hearing in general. There's a bunch of marketers on the line, so you might disagree. In general, we don't see pipeline as being all that uh, big of an issue relative to several years ago, but it's this double-edged sword where you get these very curious buyers who knock on the door and you have great visits with, you have great demos with, but then indecision is even higher because budgets are tighter, more eyeballs on it, more scrutiny against it. Now there's a whole bunch of secular reasons that indecision we think is on the rise, irrespective of what's going on with the economy, and it speaks more to the what's driving indecision, those three big fears. So who among us in supplier land have reduced the number of options for our buyers? It's usually the opposite. We want to grow our solution set, grow our ways that we're working with buyers. We've got new services, we've got new wrappers, we've got, like, we're all trying to grow these options, which is an attractive thing. It does its job into the store, but then paralyzes them when it comes to making a decision. The amount of information out there, of course, has only grown over time and continues to grow. And then I also think suppliers have kind of have an own goal here around the outcome uncertainty. And this has been, growing for decades. The movement towards solution selling, and more companies like do a survey of just probably 100 websites of B2B suppliers, and look how many times you see the word transformation. It's just like we're all trying to transform. We're all trying to. Well, guess what? Transformation's hard and thorny and difficult, and creates all sorts of follow-on implications about what's going to happen. Data migration and integrations and all this stuff that might be valuable and sound really attractive, but also is kind of scary and creates lots of dependencies. And so these things are all growing over time, on a secular basis, irrespective of what's going on. So we see those two things. The economy itself has heightened and exacerbated this, but at the same time, there's this kind of slow movement of more and more indecision over time.
We've recently had a couple of guests from customer success backgrounds and talking about the role of customer success, both in the buying cycle, in particular towards the end, but then also in making sure that customers are successful. Did you have any interesting findings around where customer success might be or other customer related groups might be helpful?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I always like to think about it. I mean, customer success, from my point of view, are commercial folks. So that'd be my first thing is, let's call a spade a spade. That these folks are often tasked with helping, if not responsible for, upsell, cross sell, and what have you. And those are new decisions that buyers are making. So in that respect, they are still dealing with the indecision in the same way that a new logo seller might as well. But they actually have it doubly hard because what's one of the interesting things about indecision is that it can still exist on a win even. So a buyer, you might get them across the finish line for a variety of reasons. There was a compelled purchase, budget was going to disappear, some higher up decided that they were going to make this purchase, but the indecision, if it's not treated, still lingers and still exists in a post-sale setting, and now it becomes a churn risk potential thing that the customer success now team has to deal with. they're dealing with the regret from the purchase that they just made. They're not sure that they picked the right option. They didn't feel fully comfortable that they know all that's going in. They feel like they're going to get caught by surprise. And so, again, this is something the customer success team really needs to now handle and deal with, a problem they didn't create, but now are forced to manage and navigate.
Yeah, a heck of a lot of dynamics there. And just thinking about, kind of the SaaS world too, and customer success. If you were recommending your book, would you recommend it both to customer success as well as sales? And it's almost like all go to market motions as I think about it. Maybe I'm answering your question.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, I'm a biased person here, but yeah, I think there's wide-ranging implications for product as well, for marketing, for customer success, for account management, and for senior leaders too, about how we think about packaging our product sets, about how we think about helping our buyers as they go to make decisions, about helping them enact the change, on the back end. So yeah, I think there are sort of very wide-ranging implications. The other thing about indecision is we all can identify with it because we all struggle with it ourselves. And so that's a source we can run to try to help us understand. Wait, why would this be like would this happens to me in the restaurant, or it happens to my friend, when they go to try to plan a trip? It shouldn't be all that surprising this is happening to your buyers at the same time.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. And actually one of the things I want to pause on for a second is this idea of reduced product choices. I think it's really tempting for a lot of companies to decide they want to add new things when they're not seeing the revenue from the existing things. What would be some guidance you'd offer to help people really consider whether or not that new revenue stream is going to be successful? And I'm even thinking, and successful in the time frame you need it to be, because you won't have that proof of success. Any guidance there for people making those choices, whether to double down on what you have or add new?
Look, I think there's a lot of complexity as you go to make those types of decisions as a senior team, and some of it can go back to general things around product market fit, and also you know whether it's worth changing focus or widening your focus and your aperture as a business. And our research doesn't speak to that necessarily. The What I can say though is that if you are going to go to market with a wider set of capabilities, I would be careful to help your team package that in ways that feels like it's prescriptive and feels like um, there's a clear reason to choose this thing versus that thing. People in general and buyers especially really stink in making trade-offs. We don't go through life with like Gantt charts with little bubbles like this thing's better than this thing. It's like, so it's really difficult for them to make sense for like, this thing feels just as good as this other thing. How do I make sense of it? And the more options you give them, the worse that's going to get. So if you're going to do it, you better arm your team with ways to help make sense of that for your team or for your customers, I should say.
Do you feel that holds true in any vertical, like a SaaS versus say professional services, where you're doing consulting work versus like SaaS type options?
Yeah, for sure. In a professional services setting, it's a little different because you often are the product, and so you're sitting with them in a post-sale setting as well. So you maybe get a little bit more leeway on that front
Mm,
because you're sort of contractually obligated to kind of be there with them along the way.
yes.
They know whose throat to choke, if you will,
Hmm.
rather than handing it off to somebody else. But I do think you could argue it's there's harder elements about professional services, that it's such a trust based transaction at that point. I just made some people cringe by saying transaction in a professional services setting. Um, but yeah, so because of that, you're really trying to that's a long term trust building process you have to go through, that probably have to overcome even more. You have upsides and downsides on that.
Gotcha. I was just noticing time here. I don't know if any closing thoughts on the book. And once again, highly recommend you get the book. Let me put it back up in the comments here too. It's an excellent read. But any last thoughts as we wrap up here?
No, I just go to jolteffect.com. You can find information on the book. There's free tools you can download as well. For those that are inclined, we've got a full curriculum and full course on the site, as well as we work directly with teams as they're taking action on some of these findings, helping their teams to come up a learning curve and help overcome indecision. So reach out. Happy to have those discussions if it would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is incredibly helpful, and I think something people really need to be focused on. As you said early on in the conversation, getting a few more people, to say yes and get past their indecision will have a outsized effect on your results. So thank you for bringing us this really, really valuable research and your perspectives today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been awesome, Ted. Really appreciate you investing the time. And next week, same time, we've got Andy Joels, who's going to be sharing some AI perspective. We've had a couple people talking about AI, AJ Manglini, as well as Nicole Leffer, and now Andy Joels will be joining us as well next week. So with that, we will see you all next week.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Happy
Thank you.
Friday.